Welcome to Casual Conversations, brought to you by Momentum Ministries, helping you attain, maintain, and regain spiritual momentum. Let's join the conversation with Scott Wade, president of Momentum Ministries.
It's great to have you joining us on Casual Conversations today. I'm Scott Wade. I'm an evangelist in the Church of the Nazarene. I like to say that. It's only been a few years that I've been doing that. But also, I'm the president of Momentum Ministries and the author of several books. And I just have a new book that came out just a few months ago, The Disciple's Compass. And so if you're interested in what are the marks of a disciple, what makes a person, or what does a person who follows Jesus Christ look like, you might be interested in buying that book. It's available on Amazon. So anyway, that's my only claim to intellectualism is a few books that I've done. But our guest today, if you've been watching before, you know Dr. Bruce Evans. Hey, Bruce, it's great to see you.
Hey, Scott, good to see you too.
Thanks for coming on, man. I am so encouraged by the things that we have talked about and the other times that you've been a guest on Casual Conversations. And I just want to continue kind of where we left off last time. We were talking about, I think, the Goldilocks effect, that things were just right on the earth and how life appeared, and things were just right for the earth and the solar system and the galaxy. I don't know how you unpacked all that though. And it's really amazing that God put that all together. Well, today I want us to go down an avenue, Dr. Evans, that we had begun talking about, and that is Darwinism. And maybe you can refresh us a little bit about Darwin. I know you talked about him to some degree in our last episode, but maybe just give us a quick refresher. And then I want you to talk about some of the problems maybe with Darwinism. So I don't know if I teed you up right or not, but you can correct all my mistakes as you go. So Bruce Evans, thank you.
Well, I'll just take it from there then.
Okay.
So I think a lot of people, when they think of Darwin, Charles Darwin, they think, oh, bad guy, and don't want anything to do with him. Other people think he presented what he talked about in his books and in his writings. And yeah, it's so true. I mean, but then there are a lot of people in between that don't know what to think about him or his ideas. So I think Charles Darwin, he put forth some ideas that some people had thought about. Folks like Aristotle knew that or surmised that organisms have evolved over time, right? There's the simple idea of evolutionary ideas. And Darwin's magic was that he came along and said, hey, I know how it might have happened. So that's why when he published his Origin of Species in 1859, after having spent many years thinking about these things, after having spent 5 years on the HMS Beagle going, basically around the world and looking at fossils, looking at various places, he got lots of his ideas by going to South America, going to the Galapagos Islands off the coast of Ecuador, and thinking about how fossils might relate to one another, how living species might relate to one another, such as the birds in the Galapagos. Although he really didn't spend a lot of time with them, it did help him a little bit. So the basic idea of Darwinism is there are species that exist at any given time. Those species will reproduce and give you the next generation. And that next generation may be slightly different in some of the aspects that are controlled by the genes. And if that happens, it happens because there are random mutations in the genome, in the DNA, random mutations, changes that can affect the phenotypes, which are the things about us, the color of our hair, or the length of our fingernail, any aspect you can think of. A lot of that's controlled by the genes. So if there are variations because of mutations, which, by the way, Darwin didn't know anything about DNA or mutations. We just didn't know it then. If there are variations caused by mutations, then selection pressures within the environment somehow can cause changes in the percentage of those mutations in the next generation and cause very slight changes in the outcomes of that next generation. If that occurs over long enough periods of time, you can create new species, new subspecies, and the vast variety of organisms which exist on the planet today. And these processes are very, very slow. But Darwin said, hey, all you need, the magic was time, right? If we have enough time, anything can happen. And so that's the basic idea that he came out with in 1859. And over time, that would cause new species to form. And from those new species, even newer species would form from them. And eventually you get the diversity we have.
So you mentioned the title of his work was Origin of the Species. Did
Yeah.
he actually go all the way back to the first in his thinking or research or writing to that first living organism and then propose that everything came from that?
In some ways, yes, some ways, no. He really didn't know what a cell was because we hadn't really discovered what's inside a cell. So he didn't know about DNA, RNA, proteins, the organelles in there that run the factory, which we call a cell. So he was at a deficit in terms of knowledge just because we had no way to know. He really didn't talk much about the origin of the species in the first place. He didn't talk about the origin of life.
Uh-huh.
There's some letters where he wrote to colleagues, and he talked about the possibilities of there being a, quote, warm little pond where these things might have come together and formed the first life. But he really didn't. I guess scientists were just not ready to think much about those things because we didn't have information to form hypotheses. So he was more about, if you have species that exist, how can they change over time?
Okay.
So there was one diagram in that book, The Origin of Species, and it showed how organisms could have descended from one another. And he didn't even show that it was actually one initial organism. He didn't know. He thought maybe there were more than one. So that was some ideas he had, but he really didn't know how to flesh them out very well in specifics. He had the fossil record, so he knew some things. And he had the diversity of species that existed at that time, and still most of which exist today. That's what he had to work with.
There was no carbon dating or anything like that. So was he looking at fossils maybe by the layer of where they were found, the relative age?
Yeah, there was a guy named, I believe his name was William Smith, who was very important in England at looking at the fossil strata. Basically, he was looking at the geological strata.
Gotcha.
And saying, he suggested that the reason these strata can be found in different areas of England and look similar is because the ones that are deepest down were laid down first. So Darwin knew that. Okay. And some of the really old rocks were in Wales, where they were called the Cambrian. And so he knew about the fossil record that was in the Cambrian. And that he knew that the Cambrian fauna seemed to have sprung out of nowhere. And he commented that it really is a problem. And he didn't know much about it because he had those rocks, but we've discovered much more about the Cambrian in Western Canada and in some parts of China. We now have a lot more about the Cambrian fauna, and it still seems to have sprung out of nowhere. So that's one of the problems with the fossil record. The fossil record does show that in different strata, you find different organisms. And so, if you're looking for dinosaurs, don't be looking in places that are newer than about 63 million years old in that dating system, right? And don't look any older than about 225 because you're just not going to find them. They're found in those specific time periods within the geological record. Now, young Earth creationists would argue with my dates, and that's fine. But that's the way that most people would look at that.
So Darwin then, let me just summarize where you are to this point. Darwin didn't concern himself so much with the origin of life, but with the evolution or change of species and maybe even development through that process of new species.
Right. That's
And
right.
he did a lot of that work or most of that work through fossils.
That was, well, part of it was he compared fossils from different continents like Africa and South America, or South America and even South America with the Galapagos, and comparing and thinking about how could they have come about that way. So the distribution of fossils, the distribution of current species on the planet also helped him out with that. The relationships of things like a dolphin's flipper to a bird's wing to a horse's leg, he also looked at those and tried to compare those. So there were a number of things that helped him with his ideas.
So that's Darwin. What is a neo-Darwinism?
Well, Darwin published that first book in 1859. So, and it was a big deal. And so over time, once we discovered cells and we discovered genes and we discovered genetics, so people like Gregor Mendel, Thomas Hunt Morgan worked with fruit flies at Columbia University in New York. We discovered what genes were. We knew about DNA from the chemists in 1869, but we didn't know much about it, right? And we didn't know till 1953 about how DNA works. So that's a long period of time. But we started to understand more about developmental processes, started to develop more about genetics, even though we didn't know quite what that meant. But people like Morgan, working with fruit flies, looking at the mutations, could follow those mutations through generations, which is what Mendel did, which is what Morgan did. And we started to say, okay, genetics must have something to do with the change of organisms over time. So neo-Darwinism is kind of a mixture of Darwin's original ideas mixed with what we've learned a lot over time about genetics, and then add into that how genetics is related to the development of the specific organism. Like at one time, you and I each were one cell, right? And then we were two, and then, now we are trillions. How do we develop during our lifetime, and which genes get turned on at which stages, and how they get turned on and how they get turned off, and all those things are part now of what we try to understand about developmental processes within the organism, but also within the species and the diversity of species.
So neo-Darwinism takes the kind of the framework, I guess you'd say, and then is able to go way down deep or to the minute detail.
And yeah, you're right. Looking a lot more at the details of what we now understand that he couldn't have.
What about the impact of time and the understanding that, well, maybe it's more than 1 million years? When did that come about?
Well, at the time Darwin was around, as I understand, Darwin thought the world was about 1 million years old. And in my mind, what's 1 million years? That's a long, long time, right? Well, as we started to understand the ideas about radioactive decay helped us think about how old the Earth might be. And so once we just started to think about that and apply those processes to geology, then we started to say, whoa, it might be much, much older than that. Now, I don't know the specific dates about when we came about that. Things like plate tectonic theory as well helped us to look at the continents and look at the plates and decide, oh, they've moved very, very slowly over long periods of time. And that helped us understand how old the Earth might be. So by the 1960s, I would say we understood about DNA, the basics, how it encoded information, how it related to proteins and the expression of those genes in the form of the proteins. Like we talked about, I think 2 times ago when we chatted about hemoglobin, collagen, the proteins in our bodies, coded by the genes, which in 1953, Watson and Crick and 2 other colleagues were involved in developing the ideas that DNA is the genetic material. It's made of the 4 bases in a double helical molecule, which we call DNA. And when we add other things like proteins to it, we can call that a chromosome. And that's what we find inside the nucleus of our cells. We find that inside bacteria. All living things are going to have that DNA.
So you've got you're boring down into the very finite details of structure. You're expanding the time. Anything happening as far as statistics or statistical analysis that help this?
Yes. One of the things that has come about is population genetics, looking at not just populations of one organism and how that might change, but if change is going to happen, it's going to happen within populations. Now, it's made up of individuals, but the population, the gene pool, that whole idea of the gene pool is the totality of the genes that are in any given population. So that population now, if you can statistically analyze how the gene pool changes over time in that population, then you can say something about the relative proportions of those specific types of genes, the alleles, the different forms of the same gene, how they change over time within a specific population. And that's been studied for a long time now. And we know a good bit about population genetics. And if you don't start analyzing that with statistics, it's meaningless.
Mm-hmm.
And things like, if we look at what is called the molecular clock, we can look at how specific genes, which are conserved within most populations, like something like cytochrome C, the gene, if we look at that gene and look how it is different in different organisms, we can create these maps that may or may not be true, but they relate one organism to another based on how different the sequence is within those genes. Now, unfortunately, a lot of that is done without statistical analysis. So it doesn't mean a whole lot in terms of specifically how organisms are related to one another. It does tell us something, but it doesn't really tell us how long ago something happened, even though we get a general sense of that. So there are some problems with that, but in a general sense, it seems to be a good way to look at genes, is to relate how their sequences change.
So let's maybe ask the question of what's the problem? You mentioned, I don't know if it was in one of our conversations before, just something that as we back and forth with email, but you said that there's some problems with Darwinism or Neo-Darwinism. What did you mean by that?
One of the things is Darwinism is a series of hypotheses, and when hypotheses have been supported, then you call it a theory, and lots of people would call Darwinism a theory, and some people would say it's a fact that we've supported it enough that it's a fact. Well, I certainly wouldn't go that far. And the word theory is a mess. Theory means so many things, different things to different people. I just don't like that term because you're using it in different ways. And therefore you can say, well, it's a theory. And they'll say, well, here's what a theory is. I don't like to use that word. But if we go back to Darwinism and say, okay, what should it show us? It should show us within the fossil record that the older you go in the fossil record, the more primitive things become. And that's not always going to be true, but basically that's going to be true. And therefore you should find the simplest organisms in the deepest layers. Well, here's what really happens. And Darwin knew this. And the Burgess Shale in British Columbia and fossil beds in China have supported this as well. The Cambrian, which is about 530 million years ago, the Cambrian rock strata and the fossils found within that seem to appear out of nowhere. If Darwinism is true, then what has to happen is that organisms have to slowly change over long periods of time. And what appears in the Cambrian fauna is there wasn't much, boom, there was everything. all at once within about a 10 million year span. Which,
all at once, huh? 10 million years.
well, to you and me, but when we're thinking about these long-term processes, that's not very long at all for things to change. And when we say that, it doesn't mean, oh, cats showed up and dogs showed up. And no. The basic body plans showed up. So there was a primitive vertebrate-like animal called Pikaia, and it was found in these strata. It was not a reptile. It was not an amphibian. It was not a fish, but it had the basic body plan for those kinds of animals. And we call them chordates because we have a notochord, or at least at one point in our life, we had a notochord. And we have certain characteristics, and those characteristics are found in that body plan. It doesn't seem to relate well to other body plans, like jellyfish, like the arthropods, which would include the insects and the lobsters and things like that. So all at once, these body plans, some of which have gone extinct. There's some really weird organisms in those fauna, but they all seem to show up. That's a real problem. And in fact, Time magazine, which is no friend to non-Darwinian ideas, they had at one point, I don't remember what year it would have been, but somewhere around 2000, I would think, they had on the front cover, Biology's Big Bang. That's what they called it. And it was the Cambrian fauna. So that's probably, if you're looking at Darwinism saying, does Darwinism work? That's the number one problem. Now, you might say, well, those fossils really didn't, the earlier fossils were there, but they didn't fossilize, so we really don't have that data. Well, over time, that has been shown to be very unlikely. That there are fossils of bacteria, there are fossils of some other organisms, there's fossils of the Ediacaran formation, which we don't understand what those are. They're just weird things. We don't understand how they relate to anything. But a lot of these body plans were soft-bodied, and therefore you would say, oh, only hard things fossilize. Well, in this case, no, they didn't. So it's remotely possible that those organisms existed, developed slowly into all these. I think I may be wrong with the number. I think it's 23 different body plans are found in the Cambrian, from nothing or very little, and that is a big question. We don't understand it. I don't claim to know the answer, but it certainly is a real stumbling block to saying, oh, these organisms develop slowly. And what it means, I'll let your listeners think about that and read about that and make up their own minds.
Hi, I'm Amy. At Momentum Ministries, we're committed to sharing the gospel through books, podcasts, and speaking engagements, but we can't do it alone. Your support makes it possible to spread God's word, equip believers, and encourage churches. Would you prayerfully consider donating today? Every gift, big or small, helps move the kingdom forward. Visit MomentumMinistries.org to give and be a part of what God is doing through this ministry, helping individuals and churches attain, maintain, and regain spiritual momentum. Thank you for your generosity.
So it seems like that problem is focused at the beginning or the outset of this fossil record. Are there any other problems with Darwinism or Neo-Darwinism that came up, that later in the whole process of evolution?
Well, one of the things we'd like to do is look at the fossil record and try to form trees of how organisms are related to one another. We don't know that they were related to one another, but it seems plausible that they were based on their characteristics. How many legs, what kind of body plan, did they have eyes, all sorts of things. If I look at two cats, if I look at a lion and a tiger, I'm going to say this dog over here and this wolf are more closely related to one another than that tiger and lion are. Okay, let me make that straight. The dog and the wolf are more closely related to one another than they are to the cats over here. The tiger and the lion are more closely related to one another than they are to the dog and wolf, right? So based on how the body looks and the characteristics, what we call phenotypes, which we can see in the fossil record, then we can make these trees. And maybe some of them are true. Part of the one problem lies in we also do the same thing with genes. And we try to take the DNA sequences or the protein sequences within organisms for the same kinds of proteins, same kinds of genes, and look at how they differ, and then form trees about how they are related based on the diversity of their gene sequences. And that's fine. It makes sense. It may or may not be how that all happened, but it does make sense. Okay, here's just an example of one of the problems that can arise, and this has to do with whales. Whales are very interesting animals because they were, if Darwinism is true, they developed at least partially on land, and then they went into the water. At some point, somehow, they got into the water and developed the differences. They're physiological differences that you have to have if you're going to live entirely in water than if you're going to live entirely on land. So it's not just how the organism looks and where is the blowhole on top of the head and things like that. That's part of it, but it's not just that. But there's a series of whale-like fossils, including organisms called Pachycetus, Ambulocetus, cetus meaning whale. The cetaceans are whales. And there's a series that has been shown to have some resemblance to one another. And of course, trying to show how an organism like Pachycetus might have developed into what we call modern whales now. And part of there's some arguments there about pros and cons of whether that works or not, which are interesting. But one of the things is if you look at the DNA, if you look at the genetic sequences, it seems that whales are closely related to the hippopotami. Whales, hippopotamus. Hippopotamus is in the group that includes cows and sheep and things like that. So they're related to those kinds of animals, whales.
In the DNA.
In the DNA. If you look at the genetic sequences. If you look in the fossil record, it seems like Pachycetus, what some would call the earliest whale, although that's not definitive. But Pachycetus, the reason that we think that they were whale ancestors is based in part upon a specific part of the skull, which is different in whales from other organisms. Well, it's found in Pachycetus. So that would indicate, that's where that started. But the head of Pachycetus looks like a wolf. That's a carnivore, right? Much, much different from a hippo. So things like that, the fossil record would suggest that whales are descendants of carnivores, a whole different group of mammals. And the molecular evidence would suggest that they're more closely related to hippos, totally different groups. And people like Philip Gingrich, a researcher named Thewison, they've written about this and very interesting. I mean, they've done some really good work on this, and they don't really know what to think of it either. They have their hypotheses, but they're not sure what to think of how to relate those. And that's one example of how we just don't know what that means.
Well, you and I talked earlier before we came on about the possibility that I'm going to come from South Carolina to Fort Wayne, Indiana. Now, I start here, I end up there where you are, or Huntington.
Come on up.
Come on. I could go the west route or I could go the east route, but I'm going to arrive there. Is there anything like that that can happen in this the species, the evolution of the species, or getting to this? Maybe some came through the wolf route, maybe some came through the hippo route, but they all ended up at the whales.
Well, something similar to that is called convergent evolution. And convergent evolution is so it's basically something we don't understand. When two organisms seem to arrive at a similar phenotype, but the fossil record or the molecular evidence or however you got there, however you got that evidence, it seems that they arrived from different sources. So that two different organisms arrived at the same solution to an environmental problem, but through different pathways. We call that convergent evolution. So some common characteristics, according to that idea, come about through different pathways. Some common characteristics come about because of common ancestry. And there's a problem with the thinking there, because if a trait like that is used as evidence of common ancestry, but when other evidence shows that it's not common ancestry, then we also have an answer. It came about through convergent evolution. Then the evidence of common ancestry being common characteristics no longer holds, because if it can come about through either pathway, then you don't know what pathway it came through.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it's much more complicated than that, but that's the simple idea about convergent evolution. Like some venoms, different proteins in certain organisms seem to be very similar, but the organisms themselves are very different. And therefore, it's been suggested that they arrived at those proteins through convergent evolution. And it may be true, I don't know, but there's a logical error in there, in that those common characteristics could have come about through either of two pathways, and you can't definitively say which way they came about.
All right, so you've got those problems. We're gonna have to wrap it up here. Are there any other problems with neo-Darwinism before we go that you'd want to bring about? And then I want you to finish with what's this have to do with faith?
Okay.
With a comment there.
I think one of the things that would do your listeners well is to read some of the evolutionary literature. Go back and read Darwin, read some of Richard Dawkins' ideas, because he really supports evolution. I think he's got a lot of problems with what he says. That's my opinion, but he's worth reading, right? But then go read a book like Darwin's Doubt, which is written by Stephen Meyer. Really excellent book at addressing a lot of these questions. Go read some of Jonathan Wells. He wrote a book called Icons of Evolution, and he addresses some of these problems. And look at both sides. Think about what that means for we each have our own views about things, right? And I may be right about some things, but I have to admit I may be wrong about others. And I don't necessarily know which ones are which. So I'm always thinking, and I hope that your listeners are always thinking about, okay, what is the real evidence for and against something? And if it comes to evolution, don't just shy away from it. The Christians should know about evolution better than anybody else, just so we can either support it or defend it, or not support it or defend it, right? But we ought to know. We ought to understand it. And, we talk about these whole things about missing links. People talk about missing links. Well, there's a missing link. In the 1860s, Archaeopteryx was discovered. Archaeopteryx is one of those fossils that looks like a bird, but it looks like a dinosaur. It's got a tail like a dinosaur. It's got certain other skeletal characteristics like a dinosaur, but it's got feathers. It obviously had feathers. It was an amazing fossil. It's probably the most famous fossil in the world. Archaeopteryx seemed to be the first bird, but over time, researchers have suggested more like it may have been the first bird, but it didn't develop into modern birds. It's not an ancestor of modern birds. It was sort of a dead end. And so other kinds of missing links have come along, and they are intermediates. Like one of the famous ones is the story of the horse, about how 5-toed animals have developed slowly into the 1-toed common modern equus that we call the horse. And those are very interesting, but they don't necessarily fall in that sequence in the fossil record. And therefore, some folks would say it's not a good example. And go read about it for yourself and see what you think about that. But if I go to I think it's still there. If I go to the Field Museum in Chicago, I will see that sequence. And they will support, of course, they're going to support evolutionary theory and in every place in there. It's very interesting. Great place to go. You should go to the Field Museum. Now, in terms of how this relates to faith, my faith is grounded in, at least in part because I'm a scientist, in my logical understanding of the world. And when I was a young Christian, I asked other Christians who were in biology or related subjects how they understood the world, and I got many different answers. So I had to figure it out for myself. But my estimation is that the Bible is true, and there's a lot of logic to it. If I look at Josh McDowell's books, Evidence That Demands a Verdict, I think 2 or 3 volumes, and you can probably buy them in 1 volume, but Evidence That Demands a Verdict looks at the logical patterns or facts or prophecies that are in the Bible and how it is so well supported from that aspect, without the biology and the cosmology and all that stuff. Then I look at my biology and I look at my cosmology and other things, and I see, oh, it seems to me within my worldview, the way I logically look at the world, that supports God too. Especially look at the Big Bang. If there was a Big Bang, which most people would think there was, there had to be a cause. And what's an uncaused cause? That's God. And that's what I would say about how all this relates to my faith. My faith is stronger now after 40 years of biological thinking than it was 40 years ago.
Amen. Well, thank you. And speaking of 40, congratulations to you and Marty on 40th anniversary.
Yeah, we just went on a cruise another cruise. You and I were on one cruise together. This was just the 2 of us.
That's awesome.
Thank you.
Hey, and thank you for being on Casual Conversations, man. I so much appreciate this, and we're gonna take a minute to pray for our listeners and just to seek truth, in our minds, because God will be revealed in the truth. Father, I thank you for Dr. Bruce and his knowledge and wisdom. I thank you for the study and the preparation that has gone into his life and the impact that he's had on countless students across the years. And Lord, the impact in the arena of faith as he has worked in missions, as he has taught in the local church setting. I pray, God, you would bless him and Marty. Thank you for their milestone that they've reached. And Lord, our listeners today, I pray that they would be able, together with all the saints, to grasp how high, how deep, how long, how wide is the love of Christ. In all this information, may we find Jesus. I pray that in his name. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you so much, Bruce. I appreciate you coming on with us. And you better change your phone number if you don't want to come back, okay?
I got you. I'd be glad to come back. I really enjoy talking about these issues.
Every time I talk to you,
like this for years.
I come up with 2 more topics.
Hey, we'll do it.
That's a perpetual motion machine.
And your listeners have to see this, my dinosaur shirt.
Yes, we're going to have you on to talk about dinosaurs sometimes. Okay, thank you very much. And thank you to our listeners on Casual Conversations. God bless you. Have a great day.
Thanks for listening in on Casual Conversations by Momentum Ministries. Check out our website at momentumministries.org, where you will find books and other resources to help you attain, maintain, and regain spiritual momentum. God bless you and have a great day.